Thank you very much, Matt. I would like to personally welcome Dr. Scheraga to the Haberman Institute community, which now extends well beyond the DC region, and I think this evening is even extending into Europe, which is perhaps leading a lot of the climate change efforts on our planet. As a member of the Haberman Institute board, I also extend a warm debt of gratitude to Interfaith Power and Light, a Dot Shalom Reconstructionist congregation, and to Fereth Israel by partnering with us to hear Dr. Shraga's perspectives on one of, if not the, most critical environmental issues of our time, climate change. Welcome to so many of you joining us from these communities. Dr. Joel Scheraga is a nationally and internationally recognized leader and authority on the risks posed by climate change to public health, the environment, and the economy. He is the Senior Advisor for Climate Adaptation in the Office of Policy at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, a position of renewed importance under the current administration. In this role, in addition to leading the development of EPA's updated Climate Action Plan, Dr. Scheraga leads EPA's efforts to support states, tribes, local communities, and businesses as they increase their resilience to the impacts of climate change. I was fortunate to work with Joel in his prior role as the National Program Director for the Global Change Research Program at EPA. During this period, he was EPA's lead in the work of the U.S. Global Climate Research Program, USGCRP, which coordinates and integrates the scientific research on climate change supported by the U.S. government. Dr. Scheraga also participated in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, and was among those awarded the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize. In 2015, he was honored with the Presidential Rank Award, the highest honor given to career members of the Federal Senior Executive Service. Tonight, Dr. Scheraga will share his perspectives on climate change, both as a policy expert and a devout Jew. On the former, I would like to foreshadow his remarks with those of Fatih Birol, the Executive Director of the International Energy Agency, at the recent Leaders Summit on Climate. Quote, "It is clear that the level of commitment to fight climate change has never been higher. This is excellent news. But commitments alone are not enough. We need real change in the real world. Right now, the data do not match the rhetoric, and the gap is getting wider and wider." Unquote. And from the Jewish perspective, I turn to the words of Rabbi Tarfon found in Pirkei Avot, chapter 2, verse 21. It's not your responsibility to finish the work of perfecting the world, but neither are you free to desist from it. Some logistics. Dr. Scheraga will engage in a Q&A session at the end of his talk. However, since we are such a large group tonight, we ask that you please share your questions in the chat, from which they will be posed to Dr. Scheraga. As such, we will not be able to address live or hand-raised questions, as we have learned over the past year plus that this is the best way to ensure both a robust discussion and a meaningful Zoom experience for all. And with that, the Zoom screen is yours, Joel, my respected colleague and friend. Baruch haba.
Well, thank you very, very much, Kevin, for that wonderful introduction. And let me say up front, not only has Kevin been a good friend and colleague for many years, but in many ways, Kevin has also been a mentor for me over the years in thinking about issues just like climate change. And it's a real honor and pleasure for me to be here with all of you today to share with you a journey I've been on over the last couple of years, which I'll tell you about. And finally, it's an honor, truly an honor for me to share this virtual dais with Rabbi Fred Daub and Joel Novi. Before I begin, I would be remiss if I didn't immediately thank several people behind the scenes who have really made all this possible. And in particular at the Haberman Institute, I want to thank Matt, who introduced us, Becky Levy and Melissa Werbone, who've been enormously helpful preparing for this event tonight. But I also wanted to publicly acknowledge and thank my rabbi and mentor, Rabbi Mendel Abrams, who may or may not be on tonight, who really has nurtured my inquisitiveness about Jewish values and the lessons that we can learn from the Torah about how to think about our responsibilities as communities as we confront this challenging issue of climate change. So with that, let me jump right into the presentation. I'm going to be moving quickly. I have a lot to share with you, which I'm excited about. So let's get right to it. I've been going. I'm going to take you on a journey, as I said today, that I've been on for the past 2 years. And this journey all started a couple of years ago with a very personal experience. Next slide, please. This personal experience occurred during a big blizzard in Maryland. And during the blizzard, I was greeted by a friend who knew I worked at the Environmental Protection Agency on climate change issues. But this friend was also a skeptic about climate change and a very, very religious individual. And when I walked in the door, she said to me, she pointed her finger at me and she said, "This snowstorm is God's way of telling you that people can't control the climate." And I have to say, as Kevin knows, I usually have a response to everything. I was stunned. I was tongue-tied. And I truly was at a loss to know how to respond. As a scientist, I knew what the responses would be, but this was somebody coming from a very religious belief in a God who controlled everything. And that was the beginning of my journey. Next slide, please. As I spent months and months trying to think about how to communicate and engage this individual, I stumbled on this quote from Maimonides, which really helped me begin to think about how to approach this issue. As Maimonides said, conflicts between science and the Bible arise from either a lack of scientific knowledge or a defective understanding of the Bible. And that got me to thinking. It got me to thinking about how to begin to link my understanding of the science of climate change with everything I had learned back in yeshiva about the Torah. Next slide, please. So I'm going to take you on that journey. And let me start at the very beginning of my journey with my understanding of, as a climate scientist, of this issue of climate change. And our starting point is just to invoke, I think everybody agrees, the Earth's climate is changing. That's not a surprise. It's been changing for millions and millions of years. But what's different now is that the Earth's climate is changing at an increasingly rapid rate outside the range to which society has had to adapt in the past. And as you can see, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which Kevin Teichman alluded to earlier on, which is the international scientific body that really studies this issue, a few years ago came out and finally said scientific evidence for warming of the climate system is unequivocal. These changes are occurring and they're occurring at an increasingly rapid rate. Next slide, please. Of course, the devil is always in the details. We have to look at the evidence, and I'll just very quickly share with you some of the wealth of evidence that already exists that shows that, particularly since the Industrial Revolution in the 1880s, the rate of climate change has occurred more and more rapidly. What you're looking at here are the temperature changes over that period from 1880 all the way through 2012. And I must say this trend has continued. And as you can see, the Earth's global temperatures have been rising on average. Next slide, please. But one of the things that we try to emphasize is that climate change is more than just temperature change. We knew 30 years ago that as the Earth warms, the water cycle is going to intensify. Water is going to evaporate more rapidly into the atmosphere, and that water cycle is going to intensify. And because of that, we expected 30 years ago to begin to see more extreme events, more intense storm events, and more droughts, just by way of example. And again, the proof is in the pudding. What you're looking at here is evidence that was published in 2017 by the US government in the National Climate Assessment that shows that, in fact, over the last 50 years, the frequency of intense storm events has been rising virtually all across the country, except for a couple of locations. And if you take, for those of us who live here in the Maryland, DC, and Virginia area, you can see that the change has been rather dramatic. We've seen a 55% increase in the intensity of these storms just over the last 50 years. The sorts of storm events where, as happens here in Washington, D.C., they tend to happen during rush hour, and that's the worst time to have an intense storm event like this while people are trying to commute home. It's the sort of storm events that farmers hate because it causes runoff from their land into rivers and streams. So we have, in fact, been seeing what we expected to occur. Next slide, please. But at the other end of the spectrum, we expected to see more drought as well. And again, you can see here data from August 23rd last year showing the Western United States. And if you look at this graphic, the gray area all the way up to the red area shows areas that are abnormally dry. And as you get to the redder and redder areas, you can see that the intensity of the drought have become more and more severe. We're seeing more and more drought events like this, not just in the Western United States, but as many people know, in places like Texas and Oklahoma and elsewhere. Next slide. But again, it's not just limited to warming and intense storm events and drought. We're also we're seeing the rate of sea level rise going up across the entire globe. And again, I wanted to make this meaningful for those of us who live here in this DC area, and show you what's going on virtually in our backyard down at the naval station down in Norfolk, Virginia. This is one of the biggest, if not the most important naval station for the United States. And what you can see is that the water, when this naval station was built at the beginning of the 20th century, was 1.5 feet lower than it is today. That's how rapidly sea level has risen just over the last century. And what the Navy recognizes they have to do is they literally have to begin to elevate a lot of the infrastructure, like the port areas, so that they're not inundated and so that their ships can come and go into the naval area. Sea level is also rising. Next slide, please. Now, that's what's happening with temperature and precipitation and sea level. If that's all it was about, then we could defer to the US National Weather Service and just let them worry about it. But the real question is, why do people like you and me care about these changes in climate that are occurring? And we care, as you can see, because they have impacts on the things that you and I and everyone else care about on a day-to-day basis. At the top of that list certainly are the potential implications of climate change for human health, for the well-being of all of us. It also has important implications for the quality of the air we breathe and the water we drink, for food supplies coming out of the agriculture sector, for the health of our forests, and obviously for wildlife and species that live all across the globe. That's why we care. Next slide. Linking this again to Jewish values, as I was on this journey thinking about this, I immediately went back to Genesis, to Eden. And here's a quote from Genesis. The Lord God took the man, Adam, and placed him in the Garden of Eden to till it and tend it. We care. We are supposed to care about taking care of this planet Earth that we all live on, as well as all the animals and species that inhabit this Earth along with us. We are guardians of that planet, and we need to till it and take care of it. Next slide, please. Now, given that motivation, given that reassurance that this is a Jewish value, that we're supposed to care about all those things that climate change poses risk to, what's concerning to me as a scientist, even before I get into the question of why is the climate changing, what I'm concerned about is we are already seeing the impacts of climate change here in the United States, but all across the globe. Everything I'm saying today applies to countries all around the world. I have to tell you, when Kevin Teichman and I and others started working on this issue 30 years ago, one of the difficulties that we encountered was people would hear us and then they would say, We hear you, but this is something that's going to happen 100 years from now. We don't need to worry about this now. And what we kept saying is, no, the climate is already changing. It's already changing at a more rapid rate. And it's already having impacts on us, not just on future generations. And that's what I want to share with you. I want to give you a flavor for the type of impacts it's already having. Next slide, please. I think this slide, this actual photograph shows how dramatic the impacts are on wildlife and dramatically conveys this is happening now. This poor polar bear is looking around, literally going, where's the ice that I need to live on? I need to walk across. This polar bear is now an endangered species because of all the ice that is melting as the earth is warming. This is happening now. Next slide. What else is happening now? Well, the ecosystems. This world we're supposed to be taken care of is being destroyed. Climate change is increasing the vulnerability of our forests to all sorts of stressors, like more frequent and intense fires, to insect infestations, to drought, and other types of disease outbreaks. And again, anybody here in the United States knows that just in the past couple of years, we've had intense and increasingly more frequent wildfires in the Western United States. And you can see an example here from Oregon. Now, not only is this a concern because we're trying to protect these ecosystems, but viewing it from the perspective of climate scientists, it's also increasing the challenge that we're facing, trying to get climate change under control, trying to slow the rate of climate change by reducing the emissions of the gases known as greenhouse gases that contribute to global warming. It turns out trees, in fact, are what we call a sink for carbon dioxide, one of the more prevalent greenhouse gases. And as they grow, they absorb CO2, carbon dioxide, that otherwise would flow into the atmosphere and enhance the warming effect. As you can guess, with the burning of trees, not only is the carbon dioxide that has been sequestered in the trees emitted to the atmosphere, but you're losing that sink that would continue to uptake the carbon dioxide. It's exacerbating the problem, as well as are losing these valuable, precious ecosystems that we want to protect. Next slide, please. It's not just about forests. It's also about the wildlife that we are supposed to care for, that we learned in Genesis we have a responsibility to care for. And this is also wildlife that many of us, like our indigenous species, our indigenous populations, our Native Americans, rely on for food and nutrition. This is an example from the Pacific Northwest and California, just focusing on different types of salmon populations. And as you can see, rising temperatures are already putting these salmon at risk. Many of them are already on the endangered species list. Many of them are already at their temperature thresholds and will either die or begin to migrate north up towards Alaska and even further north, trying to survive. So we're already seeing these impacts on wildlife. Next slide. I just wanted to very quickly put up for you this map that shows you, if you look in the lower left-hand corner, you can see Alaska and where some of those salmon already are endangered, as well as in California. But you can see that we're already seeing observed changes in wildlife over most of the United States, and those little white icons for wildlife are areas where we expect to see impacts in the near future. So this is a major problem affecting all of our wildlife across the country. Next slide. It doesn't stop there. It also gets even closer to us as human beings now in terms of the things we rely on for our own survival and well-being. Water supplies are being affected by climate change. In this slide, you see an actual satellite image of California taken during the week of May 6th through the 11th of this year, real-time sharing of data with you. In California, as many of you may know, they rely heavily on snow melt as a source of water for them across the entire year. The problem is that with global warming, the period over which snow melts is beginning to increase and occur earlier and earlier and earlier in the year, along with changes in the amount of snow that they actually get in places like the Sierra. What you can see here, just a snapshot at one point in time, as of May 14th, partly because of the impacts of climate change, statewide snow water equivalent in California is 5% of normal for this date. I got to tell you, it's going to be frightening to see how they deal with this issue and the allocation of those water resources across all the competing demands in the state of California and elsewhere over the coming months. It's getting closer to home for us as human beings. Next slide. Just one more just to show you the types of impacts that are occurring. Clearly, there are also impacts on our economy, on infrastructure, as well as environmental impacts. And these have been occurring these examples are coming from the last 2 decades. On the left-hand side, you see one of the things that happened during Hurricane Katrina. You can see that in Alabama, an oil refinery was completely underwater, which clearly has environmental implications, but also resulted in delays in getting oil and natural gas distributed across the United States. And again, trying to come a little closer to home, again here in Pennsylvania, you can see the sort of infrastructure damage that occurs to our communities that we have to deal with and pay for as a result of an intense storm event. Next slide. Now, let me take a step back. And I have to confess that for years and years and years, those of us working in the climate community have been sharing examples like that. What we have heard as we've gone out and talked to folks like yourselves is they get it, but it's not yet quite real for them as individuals. And that has caused me and several other colleagues to begin to think about what I call the human face of climate change. And some of these, let me prepare you, some of these strike really hard and home. Next slide. Let me start close to home. I live in Maryland. I live very close to a place called Ellicott City in Maryland. Back in July of 2016, a very, very intense 100-year storm hit Ellicott City, and you can see the horrific damage that occurred to property, to businesses, to people's homes all across Ellicott City. It destroyed their entire downtown area where a lot of their stores were. To their credit, a lot of businesses and people stayed. Most of them stayed. Even people whose homes were damaged made the decision to rebuild and stay. Next slide. Unfortunately, again, as I've been suggesting would occur with climate change, these sorts of storms are occurring more frequently and more intensely. And almost exactly 2 years later, it was remarkable, the same sort of storm hit Ellicott City again. And as you can see, they had 8 inches of rain in just 15 hours. And the damage was horrific. Some of the businesses stayed, some are now leaving. They recognize this is the new norm. Some people whose homes had been damaged previously and they rebuilt decided, I'm not doing this again. I'm leaving. I'm going to safer ground. To their credit, the whole community now, though, recognizes this is the new norm. We do have to rebuild in a smarter way to prepare for these sorts of events in the future. And I have to tell you, just a few months ago, I went up to Ellicott City and visited and looked around, and I was amazed at the strategies they have put in place to adapt to these sorts of events that they're now anticipating. Next slide. Just want to show you, it goes beyond the area I live in, up in Massachusetts. Back in 2018, they had, within a matter of weeks, 2 100-year storms. And as you can see, again, at the human level, what this means, their entire community was underwater. People's homes were flooded. Next slide. Let's take it to something else that we as people care about. Food supplies, as you would expect, these more frequent drought events and these more intense flooding events are having dramatic impacts on the Midwestern United States, where we grow a lot of the food that we rely on and parts of the world rely on. And I have to say, on the left-hand side of your screen, this photo was taken in San Joaquin Valley back in 2014, and I couldn't help but chuckle when I saw that sign that says, "Food grows where water flows," and it ain't flowing there. And on the right-hand side, you see just 5 years later in Nebraska, a flooding event which severely damaged, had millions and millions of dollars of damages to this farmland. And let's keep in mind, it's not just impacts on the food that we rely upon, but on those farmers' livelihoods as well. Next slide. I have to share with you, this for me is one of the most heart-wrenching examples of the importance of climate change, as well as who is most vulnerable. Back in July of 1995, they had an incredible heat wave across the country, but particularly in Chicago. As a result of that heat wave, 739 people died. Most of those people were elderly who lived in poor communities and in crime-ridden neighborhoods. Now, are all those details important? It turned out that when the federal government went in with public health workers in Chicago to find these unfortunate people who had died and to try to understand why they died, what they discovered again was most of them were elderly. They were in poor neighborhoods, so they couldn't afford air conditioning. They were in crime-ridden neighborhoods, so they were afraid to even open up their windows. In many cases, they had nailed their windows shut. They were in little stoves themselves, and they were afraid to go out, to get to the street, to get to a cooling station, because they were afraid of it being a crime-ridden neighborhood. I will save the punchline for later about how the city of Chicago and former Mayor Daley responded, but I will simply share with you this quote from Isaac Ben Sheshet that says, "One is forbidden from gaining a livelihood at the expense of another's health." Clearly, you hear arguments from people like the oil industry about the importance of oil and fossil fuels in the coal industry, the importance of fossil fuels for our economic activities, and that is true. But you have to remember that because we are using those fossil fuels, we are emitting more and more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, enhancing global warming. That's leading to these impacts on people's health, and in many cases, killing people during heat waves or having other health effects on them. This is a gut-wrenching example. Next slide, please. Very quickly, again, I've already alluded to there being more frequent and intense wildfires out in California. Here are two sets of slides from 2018 and 2020, 2020 last year. On the left-hand side, I put this in again to show you the human face of these wildfires. Look at that store in that top set of photos, that store on the left, somebody's livelihood up in flames in that picture on the right. Look down below, somebody's automobile in flames. Go over and look at the picture from the wildfires in 2020. More than 1,000 homes, as well as commercial buildings, were destroyed during the wildfire. This is the human face of climate change. Very quickly, a couple of others. Next slide. I'm sure you all remember Hurricane Katrina. This is actual imagery of it hitting landfall in the Gulf of Mexico back in 2005. Next slide. What's the human face of this? This is what happened in New Orleans. We all know the horrific impact it had on New Orleans. Can you back up one slide, Becky? Take a look at that poor man with his dog sitting on the roof of that house. His home was destroyed. He's sitting on the roof waiting to be saved. That is the human face of climate change. Next slide. These things are happening more and more. In 2018, 13 years later, Hurricane Michael hit the Gulf Coast. Next slide. What's the human face? It hit Mexico Beach, Florida. And by the way, Mexico Beach is in Florida, not in Mexico, as was claimed by our former president. As you can see here, very dramatically, the human face of climate change. In the lower right-hand quadrant, you see the homes before the hurricane hit. In the upper quadrant, you see what it looked like, their homes destroyed after the hurricane hit. And finally, next slide, just one more slide again, just to bring it closer to home for us here in the Delmarva area. Photographs from the impact of Superstorm Sandy on Chicoteague Island in Virginia and on Baltimore, Maryland, when another storm hit. Folks, these sorts of things are happening on a regular basis now. This is the new norm. And it is incumbent on us, and so I'll get to in a minute, it is incumbent on us to begin to anticipate and prepare for these impacts that are, some of which are unavoidable, while at the same time making the investments necessary as a global community in order to slow the rate of climate change. Next slide. Just to really drive this home for you, how big is this problem? Just here in the United States, since 1980, we have had, if you just look at disasters that cost us at least $1 billion, $1 billion. So this is an underestimate. We have had 291 weather and climate disasters just since 1980. And it has cost us as a nation about $1.9 trillion in damages just from these 291 events. And by the way, I had to, as I was preparing for this talk, I had to update this slide. Just a few months ago, that number was $1.8 trillion. That number is also going up very, very quickly. And just as an aside, I'm not a politician, but I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that there's an interesting link or comparison between this $1.9 trillion figure and the almost $2 billion figure for the infrastructure investment bill that President Biden has proposed. Part of that investment bill is intended to invest in infrastructure to build it in a smarter way so that it is more resilient to these impacts that are occurring now and will occur more intensely and frequently in the future. Next slide. I hope I've shared with you, and I suspect a lot of you already embrace this, that climate change really has is already having significant impacts on all of us, regardless of where we live. We are all put at risk in some way by climate change. But lest we forget, in all of our communities, some are more vulnerable than others. We know that the very young children, the elderly, as I talked about earlier, people with physical infirmities, the poor, and our tribal communities are amongst the most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. Next slide. And I would suggest to you that we have a moral obligation to help those at greatest risk and least able to help themselves in our own communities, as well as in communities all across the globe. And I point to this quote from Leviticus: "Do not stand idly by the blood of your neighbor. Love your neighbor as yourself." We must not stand idly by. And this is the essence of the climate justice issue. Next slide. And again, and this is a part of Leviticus that ever since I was a little boy made a big impression on me for the importance of caring about those less fortunate than you. This is about harvesting of one's fields and vineyards. And as I'm sure a lot of you are aware, the Torah says you are not supposed to reap all the way to the edges of your field. You're supposed to leave the fruits of your labors, as it were, at the edges for the poor and the stranger. And that's what it's about. That's a reminder to me as a climate scientists involved in policymaking, make sure that as we prepare for the impacts of climate change, that we focus particularly on environmental and climate justice, and make sure we're helping those who are at greatest risk and least able to help themselves. Next slide. Let me make this real for you. Let me show you who I'm talking about. This is a tribal community called Shishmaref up in Alaska. They're a small tribal community that is in a coastal area. And what you're looking at, and you can see the whole community right there, very close to the water. And what you're looking at is how with sea level rise and with the melting of sea ice, the water has been encroaching more and more and more on their community. Sadly, it has gotten to the point where for the first time last year, the community elders took a vote and they made the decision that they're going to have to move the entire community. Sooner or later, the entire community is going to be underwater. Houses are already falling into the sea. Next slide. One other example, another tribal community in Newtok, Alaska. Their whole community sits on permafrost, underground ice, if you will, that is melting as the earth is warming, and their homes are collapsing into the ground. And they too in Newtok recognize that sooner or later, they may have to move their entire community. That's the human face of climate change. That's what climate justice is about, helping these communities that are least able to deal with these impacts. Next slide. So a reminder from Deuteronomy, tzedek, tzedek tirdaf, justice, justice you shall pursue in order that you may live. This is about equity and climate justice and environmental justice. Next slide. And again, I know I'm moving very quickly, but I really want to get to a point where this isn't a sky is falling story. I want to show you that we have the power as people to make a difference. We have opportunities to deal with this climate issue. So where I've gotten now is I've said all of this is happening, but the big question, going back to that personal incident that I had that got me on this journey, the big question is, why is the climate changing? Is this an act of God, as the skeptic friend said to me at the beginning of my journey, or is this a result of choices that people like you and me are making voluntarily on a day-to-day basis? Next slide. Now, you look at the Torah, we all know the story of Noah, which is a story about an extreme weather event. It's not about climate change. It's about one particular extreme event that occurred over a 40-day period. To Noah's credit, he had the vision, thanks to God, to anticipate and adapt, to build the ark. He also was a righteous person who recognized that there were endangered species around him, that if he didn't help save them, they would die as well. And they joined him on the ark. So we know from the Torah that there have been historically extreme events due to natural variations in climate. Next slide. But the fact is that the Earth's climate is changing for two reasons, partly because of the laws of nature, partly because of the laws of nature that God put in place when he created the world, the natural variability in climate that occurs. But it is also occurring because of choices people are freely making on a day-to-day basis, such as using fossil fuels to power their cars so that we can conveniently get from one place to another, or to heat our homes, or for other purposes. And what I'm sharing with you immediately is the finding from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and others, that we can finally say that the global warming of the past 50 years in our own lifetimes, folks, is primarily due to the actions that you and I and others are taking around the globe. Next slide. The proof is in the evidence. Here is a graphic that shows how concentrations of the one greenhouse gas, carbon dioxide, it's not the only one, but of carbon dioxide has risen dramatically from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution until now. And it's no surprise that, as we expected, because of this greenhouse effect, global temperature has also been rising coincidentally along with those increases in carbon dioxide. Next slide. So we as people, the actions we're taking are affecting the Earth's climate. And what I wanted to drive home is these are occurring because of free choices that the ability of which God gave to us. In this midrash, in the story of Adam, you can see God talks about how he's given this wonderful Garden of Eden to Adam to take care of, but he warns him not to spoil it through his own choices and his own actions. Don't destroy it, because if you do, there's no one who's going to offer to help you repair it. God gave us the ability to make choices. These actions are our own choices. They aren't choices that God is making for us. Next slide. And even King David on his deathbed reminded Solomon that he could make choices, and he wanted him to make choices to follow God's laws and commandments, and so on. It is part of our religious beliefs, our Jewish beliefs, that God has given us the ability to make choices ourselves. These outcomes are not preordained. Next slide. So what do I conclude from this at this point on this journey? I conclude that we all have a responsibility to make the right choices and confront both the causes of climate change, as well as to prepare for the impacts of climate change that are unavoidable. Next slide. And again, I got reassurance from Maimonides, this quote where he says, similarly with all potentially dangerous objects, and I view the risks of climate change as being dangerous, remove them far from yourselves and from the way of the community. That's Maimonides saying, you have the ability to make the choices to remove these dangers, to deal with these risks. Next slide. Again, remind you of that quote from Isaac Ben Sheshet, that we also have the ability to make choices to protect public health, and we have the ability to do that. Next slide. And a reminder that we also have an obligation to protect the environment, to protect the endangered species that are in fact God's creatures. In the same way that Noah was a righteous person, in his generation, we need to be righteous people as well, to make the right choices, not just to protect ourselves, but this beautiful environment in which we live and all the endangered species and species that could become endangered that we live with and are supposed to take care of. Next slide. And now turning to the good news. Okay, I know that all sounded like doom and gloom. The good news is we have opportunities to confront climate change. We have the ability to take actions both to slow the rate of climate change by reducing or mitigating the emissions of greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide and methane that enhance the greenhouse effect. But we also have the ability at the same time to adapt, to recognize that some of these impacts, because of the amount of sea level rise, which, for example, that's going to continue to occur, we have the obligation and the ability to anticipate and prepare for the impacts of climate change so that they don't have the horrific impacts on us that we can avoid. I want to emphasize, any smart policy portfolio dealing with climate change must consist of both mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions and investments to adapt and prepare and protect all of us, particularly the most vulnerable, from the impacts of climate change. Next slide. I find a lot of reassurance in our Jewish values, our Jewish heritage, that righteous people are supposed to be doing these things. As Sefer Chinuch said, righteous people do not waste in this world even a mustard seed. I translate that to mean things like, don't waste the fossil fuels that we have and we need for certain things. Let's not just use them for ridiculous purposes, and let's look for alternative ways to get things done that don't use those fossil fuels. Let me give you an example. Next slide. I love this example because I happen to be a passionate cyclist. A colleague of mine living up in Wisconsin said, in Madison, Wisconsin, if 20% of car trips were replaced by bike trips, what would happen? And he discovered a triple win. Number one, on a health side, the public health side, on average per person every year, there would be 10 pounds lost per person per year if they started cycling more and got out of their cars. Number two, he discovered that there would be significant reductions in pollutants like NOx and particulate matter that would lead to health benefits as well. And finally, he discovered that there would be significant reductions in the amount of the greenhouse gas carbon dioxide would be emitted into the atmosphere. That's one example of something you and I can do starting today that would have benefits for our own health, as well as for our communities, as well as for the globe as it tries to prepare for climate change and slow the rate of climate change. Next slide. But again, I get reassurance from Deuteronomy that it makes sense to also anticipate and prepare and adapt to the impacts of climate change. This quote, this excerpt from Deuteronomy, when you build a new house, you shall make a parapet for your roof so that you do not bring blood guilt on your house if anyone should fall from it. Not that you know with certainty that somebody will fall from it, but you know that there's a risk in the same way that there are risks posed by climate change. And it is incumbent on us to anticipate and prepare for those risks by adapting. Next slide. Let me give you an example, one that we're all familiar with, and one that goes back to our childhoods, I'm sure, and that's to plant trees in Israel. Leviticus says, when you shall come to the land, you shall plant trees. And what's cool about tree planting is it's both a strategy, a simple thing we all can do to both mitigate and adapt to climate change. Remember, trees absorb carbon dioxide. They sequester this greenhouse gas so it doesn't go up into the atmosphere. But at the same time, trees have a cooling effect. You plant them around your home or in our communities, and they cool everything around them. So we don't have to do things like use more air conditioning if you have these trees planted around your house. They're also a form of adaptation. Plus, they look beautiful, and wildlife like them. Next slide. And I'm coming to the finish line here, folks. Given now that I've gained on my road trip, as it were, I've gained reassurance that Jewish values reassure me that we are making a difference, but we have the ability and the obligation as Jews, as people, to anticipate and prepare for the impacts of climate change and try to slow the rate of climate change and to protect those who are most vulnerable. What I also discovered is we must not delay. And I have to share with you a bit of frustration and anger on my part. Again, having worked on this issue for over 30 years, we were saying these things 30 years ago. And we were telling the global community, you must start slowing the rate of climate change by reducing emissions of greenhouse gases. We haven't been doing enough. We were telling the world, think about adaptation. Start anticipating and preparing for the impacts. And again, the skeptics were saying, oh, this is a lot of baloney. This isn't really going to happen, and it's not going to happen for another years. Folks, we're at the point where, as I said earlier, we're in the new norm. The climate is changing. As I told you earlier, it's increasing, it's changing at an increasingly rapid rate. And we can't delay anymore to take a lot of action. Let me give you a very important example. Next slide. One that's near and dear to my heart. Let's look at the River Jordan, the Jordan River in Israel. And I should share with you right away that photograph on the right, which looks out at the Dead Sea, is one that I took. And you can't quite see it in this photograph, but the Dead Sea has been shrinking. And there are even sinkholes where the water used to be, where the ground is collapsing. Today, the Jordan River which flows into the Dead Sea, the Jordan River's flow is less than 10% of its historical average. Now, that's due to a lot of things, partly due to climate change and changes in the availability of water. It's also due to the way people are using water, both in Jordan and in Israel. This reduction in flow poses a real danger to the very existence of the Dead Sea. Folks, I'm sure a lot of you have been there to see it yourselves. The Dead Sea is shrinking. It's mind-boggling. And looking at that last bullet, looking at how climate change is exacerbating all of this. If we as humans continue to make those choices to burn fossil fuels at an ever increasing rate, both in the United States and in places like India and China and elsewhere, then rainfall around that part of Israel is going to diminish by 30%. Average temperatures will rise by 4.5 degrees centigrade, and the flow from the Jordan's most important tributary could fall by another 75%. This is a really scary story, and I care about it, as I'm sure a lot of you do. Next slide. But it's not a sky is falling story. Opportunities do exist to put in place smart water management practices in Israel, in Jordan, and actually in other countries in order to deal with this flow problem in the Jordan River. And the good news is if we work together to implement these water management strategies, we have a fighting chance to save the Jordan River and the Dead Sea. And one of my colleagues has shared with me, who he works at the Arva Institute in the Negev, they are working really closely with Jordan to actually put in place these smart water management practices to save the Jordan River and also to ensure that the people who need the water get the water. Next slide. So very quickly, I'm just going to rush through a couple slides just to reassure you again that things are happening here in the United States. And I know we have some friends from Europe online tonight. Let me say upfront, as I think was said earlier, we have a lot to learn from our colleagues in Europe, because in many countries in Europe, they're way ahead of us in terms of dealing with the climate change issue. So forgive me for focusing on the United States, but I just want to show you that some of our states are already taking action. Here in Maryland, where I live, we have had for the last decade a climate change strategies to deal with the risks that it poses to everyone in our state. In Alaska, even in Alaska, they have a climate change strategy, which will surprise a lot of you. The skeptic, Sarah Palin, who was a vice presidential candidate, who was very skeptical about the existence of climate change, when she was governor of Alaska, she insisted that they develop a strategy both for adapting to climate change, which you see here, but also to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions to reduce the rate of climate change. So things are happening. Next slide. And I won't go into this one in detail, but in some of our leading communities up in Boston, Massachusetts, when they were investing $3.8 billion to redesign and upgrade their wastewater treatment plant in Boston Harbor called the Deer Island plant, they recognized that it was sitting on an island. They recognized that sea level was rising and would continue to rise over the lifetime of that plant. And they had the smarts, the wherewithal, the foresight to say, we better adapt now. We better make sure that this facility won't be damaged as sea level rises. They actually made the investment to elevate portions of the facility, portions of that island, almost 2 feet, in order to increase its resilience to the potential impacts of climate change. Smart foresight on their part. Next slide. And finally, sort of to come full circle and to go back to my journey. Next slide, please. I just wanted to share with you, you all remember that horrific event that occurred in Chicago when over 700 people, mostly elderly, died during a heat wave in 1995. To their credit, they said, yeah, this is the new norm. They were hearing that from the climate scientists. They said, we need to make sure this never happens again. Within a year, they had developed a weather operations plan, an adaptation plan to ensure that those elderly in those poor neighborhoods, working with neighborhood organizations, to establish buddy programs that would safely get them out of their homes and to downtown Chicago to cooling centers so they would not die. Those things were put in place. And in 1999, when they had a heat wave similar to the one in 1995 occurred, they saved hundreds of lives. Any life lost, obviously, is horrific. But as opposed to over 700 lives lost, it was roughly 23 lives were lost due to heat stress in 1995. Their actions that they freely took as humans saved people's lives, as the Torah tells us we need to do. That's what Jewish values are all about. Next slide to wrap things up. What I want to leave you with is there are opportunities. Some of us have been taking these opportunities to anticipate these risks posed by climate change, to try to slow the rate of climate change by changing our behaviors and helping others change their behavior, and also to prepare for climate change. We are making progress, folks, but given the magnitude of the problem, as Kevin alluded to at the very beginning, much more still needs to be done. So next slide. I want to end with two last slides. One is with a parable that Rabbi Fred Dabb kindly shared with me, and I love it. The parable is one about people sitting on a ship, and one of the people took out a drill and started drilling a hole beneath him. Now, not surprisingly, in this parable, other people with him on the ship said, "What are you doing, man? We're going to die." And his response was, "Why do you care? This is about me. Isn't this hole just beneath my area that I'm drilling?" And of course, they said to him, "But man, the water's still going to rise because we're in this together, and it's going to kill us all. It's going to flood us all." That's the situation we're in with climate change. I will share with you that all too often I hear from people, "Oh, what difference does my driving a slightly more efficient car make? You know, it's not going to reduce that many greenhouse gases compared to what needs to be reduced." And my rejoinder is, in the same way that all of our actions taken together got us into this situation, all of us doing our part taken together, all of our individual actions taken together can help solve this problem. So last slide, coming full circle to where my journey started, and I've taken you on this journey. The response to my friend's admonition is, and should have been, this is not God's way of telling us that people can't control the climate. In fact, listening to Maimonides, when you combine scientific knowledge with a better understanding of the Jewish Bible, of the Torah, it empowers us to recognize that God, in fact, gave us the ability to make free choices that can influence the Earth's climate. And the choices we make today will, one way or another, either for better or for worse, affect the health and well-being of this entire beautiful planet Earth and all the people that inhabit it and all the wildlife and ecosystems for us as well as for future generations. So let me just show you the next two slides because this will be made available to you upon request. I have some suggested readings, which I understand from Becky will also be on the website or in an email tomorrow. And I encourage you to take a look at these as further readings if you're interested. And finally, last but not least, the next slide. Please do not hesitate to contact me, even beyond our Q&A session, to either call me or to email me with any questions or favors or information that you may want. I'm passionate about this, as you can tell, and I'd be delighted to help. And with that, I will stop, and I thank you for your patience. You're all very kind. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you. As moderator, I'm not sure whether Joel and I jump in here or if Matthew or the Haberman folks have any announcements besides keep the questions coming. A number have already been received, probably enough for our remaining 25 minutes, but feel free to keep them coming. Anything else from you all?
Nope, that's good. It's the two of you can take over. Thank you.
And Rabbi Fred, may I just interject? Forgive me for jumping in already, but let me also offer that if we don't get through all the questions, and there are some really good questions, please send them along to me, and I will personally follow up to the extent that I can directly to people or through the Haberman Institute.
You are very kind, and thank you for your leadership in so many areas, as well as for that of so many people on this call, many wonderful colleagues in the Jewish and secular environmental movement. Joelle Novi, one of the great leaders nationally and also in our backyard, interfaith, and also in the Jewish community. So she and I are going to kick off a bit, and then I've got a number of questions already generated from the community that we'll try to pepper in. Joelle. Bavakasha.
Thank you. Yes, I'm Joelle Novi. I use she, her. I'm with Interfaith Power and Light. And I just want to start by thanking Joel for your 30 years of work on this issue, for that you're righteous. You are certainly a righteous person in your generation. And also for the heart that you shared with us tonight in your presentation. I sometimes forget to breathe during climate presentation, so I just want to invite everyone to take a minute and take a deep breath, and to thank everyone who's here listening tonight. I know that I frequently I have a hard time talking about this, right? And it's very hard to look at directly, you know that I have some sympathy with your friend in the blizzard, even though it was wrong-headed, but she is nostalgic for a world in which she can feel comfort that only God can control the weather, and the idea that human beings are the driving force behind our climate is very disorienting. So I guess so I want to thank everyone who had the open-heartedness tonight and made the time to listen together to what is happening to our world and what we might do about it. And I guess I'll kick it back to Rabbi Fred by just the thing that gives me hope, and the thing that I hope everyone heard loud and clear from Joel's presentation, is that the good news is we don't have to be someone else in order to respond to this with integrity. All we have to be is ourselves. We just have to be Jewish people who take Jewish values and the mandate of Jewish tradition seriously to be able to respond to this issue with the urgency it requires. And we have this precautionary principle of not causing harm, and we have this mandate to do right by future generations, and we have this fierce spirit of intervention around anything where life might be at stake. We're not allowed to make a living at the expense of another's health. So I'm just sitting with, and I hope that Rabbi Fred, you can expound on this a bit. But I'm just struck tonight by how the answer is right there in who we already are and what we already value and care about.
Amen. Don't want to expound much because we're here to hear Dr. Scheraga. His lane, admittedly, is climate, and many of the questions are about policy, and many of the questions are about specific follow-up steps. There are amazing people, and Joel knows a lot about all of it, but tonight we got the science from one of the people who knows it best and is generating it with the greatest fealty. In terms of follow-ups, many questions about specific steps, tools to convince members of my congregation that action is imperative was one. And I'll pull out Linda Bergovsky from Osa Shalom in Laurel. Our congregation is early on in its environmental justice journey, although we have more experience with traditional environmental actions, recycling, tankless water heaters, composting, right? Already that question demonstrates the knowledge of the easy steps, right? And the fact that we then need to take it further. So she asks, any ideas for making the leap from these activities focused narrowly on congregation to changing hearts and minds in the community writ large? So I just want to quickly introduce that much of Joel's presentation tonight followed the tenets of the climate change messaging advice that's coming from places like George Mason across the river and Yale program on climate communications. And it's a fine line of freaking people out, but not too much, and mixing dire projections with promises of hope. And that is really, in so many ways, not only something that comes from the people with that expertise generating the best practices for how to communicate this. It's also a deeply Jewish idea that we embrace emet, truth, as not only a value, but as a midah, an attribute that we should be embracing. And that's why we are such a pro-science people, and that's why these numbers matter. And at the same time, we embrace tikva and hope. And we need more of that without it all being facile, because the dire is real, the hope is us. And so the more that we can do in follow-up with groups like Interfaith Power and Light, I'm on the national IPL board. Joelle runs the local DMV chapter. IPLDMV.org is a great place for follow-up at the level of some of those lines of questions. So Dr. Scheraga, give you a chance just to say anything you want to about either specifics of what congregations and individual Jews can do, or hope, and then I'll get to some additional questions.
Absolutely, and let me respond quickly so we can get to some of those questions. First of all, I would share with you some of the lessons we've learned over the 20, 30 years about engaging different communities and helping them understand that this is a serious issue that matters to them, as well as informing them and providing them with the tools to help them deal with this issue. We've gone through some humbling experiences, and the very first one of which was, let's not keep preaching to the choir, if I can put it in those terms. Let's not keep just talking to those people who already believe this is an issue of concern. The environmentalists, for example. There is a large community out there of people who are still very skeptical about this issue we call climate change, are very skeptical that this is something that we as human beings are causing. And it is incumbent on us to engage those communities, to be sympathetic. I mean, a lot of these people are very intelligent people, and to try to understand their perspectives and ask them, why do you believe what you believe? And so that's lesson number one. And I think it gets to what we in our own synagogues and our communities can do, which is let's find ways to reach out to identify and reach out to those communities, number one. Number two, the other lesson for us, and this doesn't apply just to climate change. At EPA, this is when we engage communities on a whole host of issues, is approach those communities, approach all communities with a dose of humility. Start out, don't walk in preaching to them, this is why you should care, this is what you need to do. But number one, respect the fact that they have a lot more knowledge about their own communities than we do. Start out by saying to them and listening, what do you care about on a day-to-day basis? What are the issues you're grappling with? And let me tell you, when you talk to those most vulnerable communities that may have never thought about the impacts of climate change on them, you hear things like feeding my children, putting a roof over my head, security issues, and so on. Once you understand those issues of concern, then think about ways to communicate why climate change may or may not make a difference and to those issues of concern to them. Why, if they put a roof over their heads and they're finally buying a home in some place like New Orleans, they should think about ensuring that that home is protected from more storm surges when hurricanes like Hurricane Katrina hit. And then finally work with them engage them in solving the problem. It's important that they buy into it. And finally, I would just simply say there was a question about tools. We as a community and at EPA, the whole federal government, and even at the state level, we have a lot of resources, communication resources that are available to help people understand why climate change matters for the things that they care about, and communication tools and resources, as well as long laundry lists of what individual people as well as the communities can do in order to slow the rate of climate change and adapt to climate change. So my apologies, that was a long-winded answer, Rabbi Dobb.
A good and important one. Thank you. One line of questions go to the theme of Lador Vador. We talk so much in our community about generation to generation, and a stat I don't think you shared on the dire side of the ledger is that carbon stays in the atmosphere for a century. So when the Torah warns us of divine retribution to the third and fourth generation, that's the blowback to our great-grandchildren from the carbon we emit today. So Elliot Figman asked, can you say more about the consequences of delaying to act on climate change? Why do you think we haven't moved as quickly as we've needed to? You don't have to go there, but Rabbi Devorah Lynn raises Lador Vador also in thinking about the economic side of this and the so-called discount rate, and how the policy needle is in so many ways against the Jewish values on this.
Great questions, absolutely great questions. And obviously we could spend days addressing all these, but let me address each of those questions very, very quickly. First of all, with thinking about future generations, our children, our grandchildren, our grandchildren, the world we're going to leave them, you're absolutely right. Some of the greenhouse gases, like carbon dioxide, stay up in the atmosphere for approximately 100 years. But there is work going on in the scientific community to think about how to draw that carbon out of the atmosphere. But let's set that aside. Other greenhouse gases like methane, which is a lot more potent of a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, only stays in the atmosphere for a decade, for about 10 years. And so there's a lot of discussion and a lot of policy discussions that have gone on about what sort of fossil fuels can you substitute one for the other in order to, for example, use more natural gas, which emits methane into the atmosphere, as opposed to coal, which puts CO2 up into the atmosphere. It's a short-term stopgap partial solution to the problem. But the question asked about how long these greenhouse gases stay in the atmosphere is a really important one, not just because of its impacts, but also because of the types of solutions, intermediate solutions, near-term solutions we can come up with to begin to deal with this problem. Number two, I have to agree with the question that was asked. Sadly, we have already committed to some impacts that will be with us for centuries. Forget just CO2, sea level rise. We have already committed to more rapidly rising sea level for the next 700 years. That's frightening to me, and it has huge implications, certainly for communities like Shishmaref and Newtalk that I was telling you about. But hey, anybody here live in the Outer Banks in North Carolina? I got to tell you, if you're thinking about buying a home, don't buy a home on the front of the bank. Buy it a couple of rows in. But I don't mean to make light of it, but there are obviously economic implications because of these long-term commitments that we've made. And as an aside, I will say to you, that's why 30 years ago, when people were telling me and my colleagues working on adaptation, oh, adaptation's a dirty word. You're waving the white flag. You're distracting people from worrying about reducing and slowing the rate of climate change. We were saying, no, no, no. Both are important because we've already committed ourselves to significant impacts that are going to affect our children and our grandchildren in the future. So when we do things like build homes, let's build them in a smarter way and in safer locations. Very quickly, question was asked, why hasn't more progress been made? I think the simple answer is part one, because of the magnitude of the problem. This is a global problem. Everybody in the global community has to be part of the solution. No single country can solve the problem by itself. And there are challenges to doing that when you've got developed and developing countries that are at different stages of development. And a lot of countries around the world are still trying to feed their people and put homes over their heads. And we have to think about how to deal with those equity issues. There are also economic issues involved. Clearly, we've got, I'll be quite blunt, we've got the oil companies, for example, the fossil fuel companies that have huge assets invested in their corporations. And they have an economic interest to try to protect their businesses. I won't go into all the shenanigans that have gone on in the past because of that, but those are real barriers to getting things done. That's a very simplistic answer, but it's going to be really, really hard to get actual action, not just the signing of protocols, but actual actions and changes in behavior. And finally, the discount rate problem. My PhD is in economics. I won't bore people with all the details about it. It's a very real problem. Essentially what it says is we put a much lower value on impacts that will happen way in the future than what's happening today. Unfortunately, because of climate change, we've got to work around using the discount rate to make our policy decisions. And there are efforts to do that. Back to you, Rabbi Dobb.
All right. Thank you. And of course, Dr. Scheraga, working for the government, has to be studiously apolitical in all of this. And yet, what is politics but bringing values into the public sphere? And so if you believe Lador Vador, generation to generation, then advocating for a higher social cost to carbon, which is just changing a number in that future discount rate, makes an absolutely massive difference as to what just logically pays for itself. What is investment rather than tzedakah, so to speak, right?
And Rabbi Dobb, the good news is, at real time, I can tell you that right now at EPA, in the Biden administration, they are re-estimating the social cost of carbon, and it is going up.
Yes, a blessing. Just as the methane rule that was worked so hard on 5 years ago was put on hold and is hopefully coming back as well. These policy details matter. And that is a place where we can get involved collectively through groups like IPL, Dayenu, and others, as well as, of course, the secular environmental world. They're also considerations for us too. Some of the questions were, how big a difference does eating lower on the food chain, less meat, make, given the outsized climate impact of the cattle industry? Or how great of a promise are electric cars, at least until we fully green the grid, right? A lot of questions of personal responsibility, and each of us can cut our impacts by finding the answers to those kinds of questions, even as the biggest needle we can move comes when we gather together and organize. And in a moment, we're going to turn to Joel for building on that. I did want to pull out from longtime Haberman leader, Rabbi Gordy Fuller. Do you have projected numbers of expected climate refugees over the next X number of years, just to accentuate the way that immigration, which is such an issue on the Jewish community agenda, given our history and our values, is so tied up with the climate crisis?
That's a great question. I confess that I personally am not aware that any such projections, actual numeric projections, exist. I will share with you that there is a lot of attention being paid to the climate refugee issue. It's very real. In the Obama administration, towards the end of the Obama administration, as a federal family, agencies were getting together to think about how to help those refugees, recognizing there are going to be refugees, for example, from the Maldives. I mean, Maldives are going under, I hate to say it, sooner or later, the Maldives Islands will be submerged. They know that. And at some point, they're going to have to migrate. The Obama administration began an effort to think about how we as a federal government can work with different communities to help them when they have to migrate. An example, another one is Shishmaref. There's also a tribal community in Louisiana that has to migrate. Picture having to move your whole community. Where do you get the resources to do that? Where do you go? Where will you be welcomed? Think about all the refugees from Hurricane Katrina. I actually didn't present it tonight, but we do have a map that shows where all these people went across the United States. It is mind-boggling. So to answer the question, forgive my long-winded answers. I get very passionate about these things, but I'm not aware of any such numeric projection right now. People are working on those. What died during that effort during the Obama administration to think about how to help these climate refugees clearly died during the Trump administration, but has been resurrected during the Biden administration. And I encourage all of you to take a look at Executive Order 14008, better known as Tackling the Climate Crisis at Home and Abroad, which the president signed in his first week of office. And in there is a whole section, and it actually starts with a section on our obligations to the global community. Take a look at it. You'll see we're trying to make a difference.
That is a brilliant segue to our wrap up that begins with Joel, caring for the climate at home and abroad, because each of us can do it ourselves in our homes, in our collective homes, like our congregations. There's a lot of work to be done just locally in the Jewish community, and of course, in the larger world. And to help at the individual, the congregational, and the state and national and global level, Interfaith Power and Light is one of the great resources. Joelle.
Thank you so much. So it was put in the chat earlier, and I'm going to encourage folks to double click on the link you see there and fill it out as I'm talking. Tonight, I want to invite absolutely everyone who's hearing my voice to double click on that and share with us how you want to take action. So I want to say first that I think, you know, our tradition supports us in responding in some ways, but I think it also can be, you know, can constrain us a little bit. I heard that Joel mentioned Noah being a righteous man in his generation for just building a very small boat that saved just a few, you know, select species, and basically left everything else to be destroyed. And we sort of focus on the boat and the folks who got a ticket out of that situation. Whereas the Sefer HaChinuch that you cited, you know, asks us to that righteous people save everything possible from destruction. And so I've been very influenced by the teaching of Rabbi Julia Watts-Belzer at Georgetown, who's really encouraging all of us to get out of our Noah's Ark theologies that sort of accept high levels of destruction for lots and lots of creation and lots of human beings, and to really ask, what would the ark that saves everything we can save look like in this moment? We are, as Joel said, the first generation to be experiencing the impacts of climate change, and the last generation that's going to be able to do anything about it. And so we are in this intense and awesome in the awful way, moment of needing to ask, what is mine to do? What can each of us do? And often after talks like this, that's what I hear the most is, what is the one thing that one person can do about a global challenge that is, you know, so much bigger than any one of us? What can one individual do? And the one answer I would say is, get connected. Don't be one person. Get connected to a group of people who are going to call you to action over and over again to respond on this issue. And that's why we're inviting you to double click on the link in the chat and get connected, whether that's the green group at your shul, whether that is a grassroots group like Interfaith Power and Light. There are a number of Jewish organizations responding to climate change now, groups that are there are several Jewish Climate Action Network groups that are working together through a Jewish Earth Alliance to speak out on federal policy issues. There is nationally a group called Dayenu that is mobilizing on policy. So find a group that you can connect to, and don't respond alone, and don't and be in community with this challenge. There is some community. We did something hard tonight, which is to talk about climate change and to talk about it directly for more than an hour. It is very hard to focus on this, and I want to thank everyone who did so, and to think for yourself, having heard this and felt the feelings that you felt as you thought about it, why does climate change matter to you? Not enough of us have conversations with the people in our lives about why climate change matters to us personally, and we need to flex those muscles and practice. So I want to challenge everyone here to think about who you could have a conversation with, and what would you say if they said, well, does climate change matter to you? Why? And how would you answer that question? To Joel's point about opening these conversations in our communities, there is some community for which you are the most powerful person in the world to start a conversation about the climate crisis and how we can respond. Think about what that community is for you, but know that there is, maybe it's a Jewish community, maybe it's a workplace, maybe it's a school community, maybe it's a neighborhood group, but there is some context in which you are someone whose opinions and feelings and concerns matter to the people in that community. Think about what it would look like to open conversations about climate change like the one we had tonight with those folks, and not just to speak about what is happening, but about why it matters to you. Responding to climate change happens in 3 buckets. We talked about talking about climate change, learning together about what it means and how we are called to respond. And then we talked about going green, and Joel's talk included a lot of good examples, how we get around, how we eat, how we care for our grounds. I want to end though with a third category, and this is where the President Biden's infrastructure plan that Joel mentioned is really key, and some of the state, like the strong Maryland state policy that Joel mentioned. We have to speak out for stronger policy, and we have to do so as a movement. We cannot feel hopeful about this issue. I cannot feel hopeful about this issue unless I'm part of much bigger solutions at the scale of the problem. And the only way to be part of something that big is to join movements that are calling for stronger climate policy. And again, I invite you to double click on the link in the chat so that you can get connected to groups that will call you to action. And for the first time in my career, which is more like 12 years than 30 years, but for the first time in my career, we have a real opportunity to pass strong federal climate legislation in the process of this infrastructure plan. It is a unique moment in this work, and I just would invite anyone who feels moved or is interested in speaking out alongside other Jewish communities for that policy to get connected with our work. One more invitation to please stay connected, stay engaged, even when it's hard. We are in this together. Gratitude to Joel and to Rabbi Fred and Lila Tov.
Thank you, Dr. Scheraga, Rabbi Fred, and Joel. I think this is a nice way to end the program. So thank you all out there for joining us, and I hope you would take advantage of the links in the chat.
The freezing of Matt's screen should not be considered a climate change event.
I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight and for your attention. And again, please don't hesitate to contact me. Would love to engage with all of you on a personal level. And Joel and Rabbi Dobb, thank you so much for this opportunity and for your very thoughtful comments as well.
An honor and a delight, and kudos to the Haberman Institute for getting this going. We need this talked about in every possible venue, and lots of us are here for follow-up. I was invited to just wrap up so that anyone who's still lingering, and we're so grateful that you are, can know to consider it an evening. Judaism gives us a beautiful set of languages to appreciate. And from that place of appreciation and expressing gratitude, hoda'ah, to then be in a stance of protection and solidarity. And so we are in the middle of not only the rebirth of spring, but this bizarre, wonderful 17-year thing of the cicadas. And believe it or not, Judaism has a blessing for it. So if you haven't yet said this, the blessing when you see something unusual in the natural world that is just takes your breath away, you say, "Blessed are you, God, who makes it like this in the divine world." So I'm going to end with that bracha and an invitation that we all do way more than we are now to make sure that our great-grandchildren and that the global poor around us are able to say that kind of blessing into the future, that we leave them a world with the same imprint of divine goodness. Shekacha lo ba'olamo. Feel free to say amen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu ruach haolam shekacha lo ba'olamo. Amen. We look forward to working with you all in the future in the meeting place of Judaism and climate change.
Laila Tov.